Hello, kia ora. I'm Ali Craft from the Urban Design Forum. Thank you very much for attending today. And welcome to level 1. Yay, we made it. And we may not have to do too many more webinars. We can do it in real person in the future. Today we're going to hear from Kent Lundberg, and just really one house rule. Please keep your microphones muted until question times, and question time will be at the end after the presentation. But please feel free to add questions to the sidebar. Kent's presentation should be about 20-30 minutes. Thank you very much, Kent, for taking your time to present. A little bit about Kent. Kent works at MRCagney and is one of New Zealand's leading urban mobility specialists. He works through the design scale from regional network planning down to detailed designs at street level. Kent has particular expertise in livable street design, public transport integration and cycleway planning. Kent is also the architect of Access for Everyone, which is really underpinning the updated Auckland City Centre Masterplan. He's the lead author of the Auckland Street Design Guide and the Local Path Design Guide. Oh, and I probably should also say he happens to be my boss. So today he is going to talk about low traffic neighbourhoods. Kent, take it away from here.
Cool. Thank you, Ellie, and thanks everyone for joining in. Yeah, I'm acknowledging the fact that these webinars have been going on for several months, and this might be kind of the end of webinar season. But hopefully, this is a really useful and concise kind of presentation. What I'll be going through is a compilation of our work at MRCagney. So I have to acknowledge my coworkers who've done a lot of this. A lot of these designs and thinking come from them. A lot of my former colleagues that now have returned to the Netherlands have inspired me. And then just general kind of, I'm just really appreciate and I'm fascinated by this overwhelming interest in low traffic neighborhoods. And I think partly what makes this really exciting is the context where we're working in. We talk about things in theory in urban design, but a lot of us had a very clear glimpse of what neighborhood streets and even like busy arterials could look and how they would function and what kind of users, you know, how those streets would be quite different than they currently operate. And this is a picture of my kids, so my family, and so during lockdown we explored all across our neighborhood. We went to places we had never been before, on bikes. And before long, they didn't want to wear helmets. And my youngest, Cleo, who was in the front of this photo, she started going out and meeting her friends on bike. And it was just, it's kind of bittersweet now because we're back to a level where there's way too much traffic. But at that cusp of going into level 2, I think it was, she actually was sort of going to meet her friends on her bike, without me telling her to do something like that. So I think that's why it's really important to talk about this now and talk about ways where we can actually deliver low traffic neighborhoods in new neighborhoods, but also retrofit our current neighborhoods to achieve this sort of lifestyle. So I'll first just kind of go through this. This is the presentation. Talk about what just a brief definition of what low traffic neighborhoods are. I'm going to try to put this in a context, urban design theory context. I'm going to talk about Dutch street design, where a lot of these ideas come from, and then I'll talk about designing low traffic neighborhoods, both greenfield and retrofits, and then I'll talk about a couple of case studies. So a lot of this stuff is kind of overlapping, but I think it's really important to put it in perspective, especially with the audience, the urban design audience. I think it's a useful story. I think low traffic neighborhoods are the most exciting thing that's happened in transport planning in 60 or 70 years. So that's why I'm really stoked to be doing this and walking through some of the work we've been doing. And now we have kind of a name for it. The stuff that we've been doing for several years now has a kind of a movement. So I'm really excited to be playing a part in that. So when we talk about low traffic neighborhoods, we're talking about neighborhood streets where cars can get to every address or every property, but traffic doesn't pass through a neighborhood. So you wouldn't have a car on your street that wasn't going to a destination. It's not passing through to get to a further destination. And what this ends up doing is creating an area of streets where the traffic is much lower and it's much more organized and predictable. So you'd still have traffic, say, on streets, but you wouldn't have rat racing traffic, and you would imagine that kids would be much more confident using streets because they would know that there's lower levels of traffic, and the people that are using the streets are familiar with the neighborhood, and they won't be ripping through it. And so I guess part of that urban design context or theoretical context, one useful reference point for me, and I'm just trying to patch this together because no one's written a book about this, and no one actually even talks about it. I was at a meeting today, and people talk about streets and blocks, but they don't talk about traffic and traffic design. And I think it's a critical component of delivering really good outcomes. And so this is Appleyard's famous diagram from, I think it was 1981, livable streets. But basically, he did the sociology work that revealed that if people live on busy streets, they have a third less friends. So this instigated a lot of traffic calming in California, where Donald worked. It also introduced things like bike boulevards in Berkeley. So in Berkeley, there's kind of remnants of streetcar gridded neighborhoods that have traffic diverters. So for me, this is kind of a touch point where there was this movement, and you can still see legacies of it in some cities in Portland and in Costa Mesa, where my parents live, where people have, or where cities have introduced traffic calming and traffic restrictions. And you see some of this in Auckland too, around, usually they accompany major motorway interventions. So like the Dominion Road flyover neighborhood has a bunch of streets that have been closed off for traffic, or and including traffic diverters. So for me, this is a good starting point, thinking about kind of there's a legacy of this work, but it kind of fizzled out, and now I think there's a resurgence because just the level of populations in cities have required us to rethink how traffic works in cities. And so I have a lot of these photos from lockdown, and I took a lot of photos of cycling and kids in the street, which is were kind of the first things that came to mind. But it was really interesting to see, like, it wasn't just cycling, it was people, neighbors that were out on the street talking to each other that probably hadn't talked to each other ever before. And they were doing these kind of impromptu meetings, and they were trying to be socially distant and things like that. But these were neighbors that were finally using their streets after maybe 20 or 30 years. So imagine if our city centers, our city streets enable cycling, they enable safe access to public transport, they enable access to public town centers. And so effectively our streets are an asset, they're a public, part of the public realm, and they become kind of a facility. And in a lot of ways, streets that are designed without traffic running through them or racing through them, they effectively create the groundwork, the base of a cycling network. So this is what's really exciting. So if we have a neighborhood that's comprehensively designed for low traffic, then we have a cycleway. We don't need to have special infrastructure necessarily. And so talking more about that urban design theory, the starting point, I think, so this is about 60 years ago, there's not much traffic theory. I guess the one place that I've been able to find it is Traffic in Towns. This is written by Colin Buchanan from the UK. And he basically kind of legitimized the practice of traffic engineering. And he conceptualized this idea of a hierarchy of streets. And so streets were progressively important at the top. So the distributors are at the highest level. And then as traffic kind of comes down the hierarchy, streets are progressively less important. And this is kind of a branching structure that ended up informing a lot of modernist architecture and modernist planning. And it was overall largely kind of dismissed over the last, say, 20 years with our resurgence of new urbanism or other kind of urban design theories. And the little image on the right is kind of that construct of progressively traffic trickles down into local access streets, which is where the traffic function is much diminished. And that's where people say reach their houses. And Canberra actually has a lot of town centers that look like this. So this is that kind of modernist traffic design. And urban designers over the last 30 years, right? Well, more than 30, 50. So this is like back to Jane Jacobs' era. This kind of functional hierarchy was appalling to people because it didn't address the kind of key issues of street design and the places where we typically find that are the most diverse, most active, most vibrant places that are really important public spaces and places for transaction and interchange. Those were the places that tended to be the traffic streets. And so what the modern traffic theory did, it was kind of flip that concept around, and it basically was suggesting that town centers wouldn't be in the center. They wouldn't be on the main street. And the little diagram on the left is that kind of construct of traffic in town street hierarchy. And I think taking it to like the conceptual level, Christopher Alexander wrote about a city is not a tree, talking about this. So this kind of branching network of hierarchy of streets. And so I think it's like largely dismissed as a structurally functioning possibility for cities. But what I think we missed over the last several decades is we've essentially thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail with relation to the Dutch experience. So this is so a gridded structure, and I think so. This is a gridded structure where urban designers would acknowledge that a certain block structure would be a preferred concept, and the smaller the blocks, the better. So this is all Jane Jacobs. But when we look at these networks, we don't ever think about who's using those streets and how people walk on those streets or how they live on those streets. So we're kind of missing a dimension of the functionality of the streets, even though we're talking about small blocks, but we're actually not talking about walkability. You can have a very fine block structure, but if traffic's pouring through your neighborhood streets, like it was in my neighborhood, those aren't necessarily walkable streets. And I guess similarly, you can have a cul-de-sac-y kind of street structure, but if it's well connected, that might be a very pleasant place to walk and a very direct place to access public transport or access town centers and things like that. So I guess that's the key concept, is that we're looking at street networks, not so much, we're thinking about the function of street networks and the variety of functions that happen on those street networks. And this comes to that this kind of classic traffic engineering concept. So this is that hierarchy of streets. So the biggest, most important flow function is the motorway, and as it kind of cascades down to it becomes a local access street. This is super common, and the really tricky part is that on the image to the left, it's really gray where things are mixing up. And so even like the new movement in place framework, you're kind of like, is this really like a high important place if we're running 15,000 cars a day through Mount Eden? So it's really jumbled. But what the Dutch did in, I think this is 1990 or so, they adapted this concept, but they made a huge break between movement, that traffic function, and local access. So they just cut it off. We're like, we're not going to run traffic through our main streets. And we're not going to run traffic through neighborhoods where we're going to have kids playing. So this is the key distinction. And I think this is important part of low traffic neighborhoods. And it's also an important part of recognizing the value in having a functional hierarchy. And so all of these examples talk about traffic function and that hierarchy. And that's what enables streets that have low traffic. So this, that last diagram was from this report. So this report just documents the Dutch's experience in implementing sustainable safety. So they did this in the 90s. It's equivalent to Vision Zero. And the first thing that they did was they required every city in the country to establish a traffic hierarchy map. So every city in the Netherlands has has a map of streets that calls out whether it's a flow road, a distributor road, or a local access road. They try to keep it as simple as possible. This is like related to a sustainable safety concept of monofunctionality. They didn't want mixed streets where there's lots of traffic and lots of business activity or lots of people. So this is what established the kind of really the state-of-the-art street design that happens in the Netherlands. And eventually they had to kind of modify those three classes with in-between categories, but they were still trying to achieve the same thing. They're not mixing cyclists with busy traffic and fast speeds. They're not putting traffic through the busiest parts of their cities. And this led to things like, this probably preceded that process, but this is Houghton, where traffic is on the left, and in order to make a relatively short trip across this suburb, cars have to go out to the ring road, and it's quite long. Whereas if you're on a bike or walking, that connection is very short. So this is very much a low traffic neighborhood concept. And this also led to things like, this is the main street in Utrecht, right? They don't have traffic, but they move thousands and thousands of people on buses and bikes. So as an Anglo-urban designer, I guess we've been trained to think about urban vitality and even urban productivity and things like that based on traffic. Like the busy main streets are really important because there's traffic in them, and they just don't do that there, and it doesn't make sense. And it's kind of rethinking about what drives urban value and attractiveness. It's not the traffic on the streets, so it's totally different. And I'm constantly running into constantly challenged by people that suggest that traffic is what makes great streets. Even the O'Connell Street out front, I had a robust debate with probably a lot of people's professors about closing the street to traffic, and it was just like he didn't want anything to do with it. He's like, oh, but traffic brings eyes on the street. He was using all this stuff, but it's like traffic essentially just displaces people from O'Connell Street. It's also a very dense area, and there's people all over the place all the time. So it's not universal, but vehicle traffic does not provide energy, as I guess is the point. And then in the Netherlands too, they figured out how these tricky in-between streets work. So how do we make streets that are really easy to cross? And this is a new street in Utrecht. That they've ended up removing traffic signals because it improves traffic flow, but then it's also super easy to cross. So this is state of the art. And I guess, circling back to that Netherlands story. So in the 90s, when they did that sustainable safety program, they've been redoing all of their neighborhoods. So this is Rijswijk between Delft and The Hague. This is a gridded street neighborhood, but traffic used to cut through it. So what they have been doing for 20 years is retrofitting neighborhoods to remove through traffic. And this is kind of a tricky diagonal, or it's a diverter. I'm not even sure if you call it diagonal because I think it's two-way traffic heads in, but they're forced onto a one-way street. So it's a technique that you can do to filter traffic. So this is a modal filter. So you can see people can walk and cycle in all directions, but you can't drive in all directions. Traffic is forced off. And so this limits traffic to just the people that live in this little grid of streets. And increasingly you see this in other greenfield neighborhoods. So this is Valbonne in Freiburg. And I think it's really interesting because you see great projects like this and you see people in the street, you see great architecture, and you kind of wonder what's the glue that holds it together. And then I checked the Google Maps, and you can't drive through these streets like you can walk through them or cycle through them, or there's also a light rail that goes down the middle of them. But this is a gridded street, and if you can see in the upper left corner, there's a green network that forms the grid, but the traffic network is much more sparse. And so traffic is directed, I think, to the north. I'm not super familiar with it, but just by checking the traffic, you can see how this works in a lot of cities. This is an example of how we've applied that approach to a greenfield in New Zealand. So we were presented with a master plan in the Bay of Plenty that had this really cool structure and really tight grids, and things were lined up to certain viewpoints and things like that. But what they didn't have was they didn't have a hierarchy of streets. So every gridded street would potentially be a traffic street, or that street that a kid wouldn't be allowed to play on, or a busy street that you wouldn't be able to cross to go to the beach. So we came up with a concept of effectively low traffic neighborhood across this peninsula, but we put the distributor on the south side so people across that area could walk to the beach and kids could walk to the beach by themselves. And then we introduced these hierarchies of streets, and we ended up using a connector street as a middle street. And then we ended up putting a busway right through the middle of it. And then what's formed between those streets are those traffic cells and those living streets, if you want to call them. And then they're connected with key infrastructure to cross over if there's a busy street. Key links, pedestrian crossings are provided. And this is happening everywhere. The UK in particular is really progressing with low traffic neighborhoods, which I think is really cool because I think we basically have similar urban design thinking. And I guess the kind of progress of urban design is largely tied to kind of the Anglosphere, unfortunately. I guess that's my exposure, so it's probably limited. But it's really great to see this happening overseas. And this is an area in Manchester where they're trying to create a cycle network across the whole, I'm not sure if it's a borough, or if it's just a place area. But so what they've done, I guess this is the kind of steps to do it. It's pretty simple. So identifying where the busy streets are, those are the distributors or the flow roads. So I think this is an A road in the middle. You might think of it as a flow road. And the other busy streets would be distributors. And then finding out what are the key assets and where are people probably wanting to travel by walking and cycling. And in this case, they identified a train station. And those busy streets form the traffic cell. And then enabling that traffic cell requires adding modal filters. And enabling people to get from one cell to the other requires adding pedestrian links or crossings. So it's that simple. This is, look this up, I'll probably use Levenshulme. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it has a lot of really great collateral on what this is, and a lot of really good public information on explaining how all of this works. And on the busy streets, we have connectors kind of typologies, and this is something we've been doing research on at MRCagney. We're trying to figure out how do we design cycleways into our 20-meter street corridors, and this is Williamson Avenue. So this is a Dutch type. I call these a flow road because these are designed to not have traffic signals. So traffic is relatively smoothly flowing, but slow. So these are slow and safe, high capacity streets that have cycleways and they're easy to cross. This is stuff we're doing internally. I'm trying to figure out how all this works. And so those filters, so Auckland has the local past design guides. Resilio and MRCagney did this about 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of this work is just kind of building on work that we've been doing for several years. And this identifies the type of filters you could introduce in your neighborhood. And hopefully people that are thinking about low traffic neighborhoods with the NZTA Innovating Streets program have used some of this. So these are techniques to basically pull through traffic out of neighborhoods. So converting two-way streets to one-way streets, facing one-way streets into each other so they can't pass through, cul-de-sacs, and other things. So all of that's in that local past design guide. I guess one thing we would like to add too is that it's as much as kind of closing down streets for traffic, but it's also, of course, opening it up for people walking and cycling. So the other key attribute of local, this kind of design is improving local connections, whether that's those kind of dark and unattractive links through houses. So making those really, really nice and safe and well lit. But also potentially adding drop ramps, filling gaps, like all those kind of things. So there's a whole other range of tools at a different level where kind of working with traffic to organize that, but also kind of expanding the network for walking and cycling and making sure that those key connections can be made across a traffic cell to the adjacent neighborhood. And the other example, you probably all have heard of this one, Waltham Forest and George Weeks. I'm not sure if he's on this call, but he wrote a great blog post about this. But this has been a work in progress for about 6 or 7 years. TfL had this program where it was a competitive program where boroughs would have to apply for the funding, and Waltham Forest had this awesome scheme of low traffic neighborhoods and the Dutch style infrastructure, cycleways on busy streets and blended side roads, so continuous footpaths across side roads. And then it's just a bunch of other supporting activities like hangars, parklets and things like that. So this seems like it's been hugely successful. Lots more walking, lots more cycling, and there's been proven health benefits for this. So that people that live here are going to live 7 months longer over average. So it's a really inspiring story. And then Ghent. So this is a kind of a higher scale city center wide concept. So freeing up that central area as a pedestrian only zone, and then having traffic cells surrounding it. So traffic can only come in and out of one cell, and traffic is directed onto ring roads. And so they did this overnight, which is just incredible to imagine something like that happening overnight. And I'm not sure if this is right, but someone suggested that this costs $10 million. So this is largely created by simple barriers in the streets to divert traffic. And it's been massively popular. So as you can see, like the cycling overnight increased something like 15%. And then heaps more public transport use. And it just generally, it seems like it's been a really successful project. And this is I guess we're looking at how traffic works in something like that. So like going from cell to cell, it's hard to drive, but walking, it's really easy. So, you'd think twice about making that trip in a car. But you want to make that trip as easy as possible in walking and cycling. So more of those kind of schemes. Ellie likes these. And this is similar to Access for Everyone. So this is what George and I did with Auckland Design Office for the Auckland City Centre Masterplan. So we had been working on this for 2 or 3 years, and we didn't know about the Ghent plan. We knew about Dutch plans like The Hague and Delft, Utrecht have similar plans, but we didn't know about Ghent. But this is a similar concept, effectively. So pushing traffic to the motorway ring road and using Mayoral Drive as an inner ring road, but you can't, conceptually, you can't drive across the Queen Street Valley. So if you're on Shortland Street and you want to meet someone at the viaduct, you can't drive there very easily. So you'd be much better just walking. And so we presented this, this is finally approved by the council, but we spent 2 years explaining this to the council. But it's basically saying that if you're you have to walk across the big trade-off is you have to walk 200 meters across a largely car-free Queen Street Valley in order to get somewhere. And that was a trade-off that they seemed happy to take because of the kind of possibilities that this would provide. So as part of that project, we looked at each of these cells, and the one I'm showing here is downtown east. So we developed a street hierarchy. So where are the streets with traffic, and how do they come in, and how do they kind of downgrade to local streets, and where are those clips in the network so the traffic doesn't run through from end to end. And so Simon Street is imagined as a transit mall. So Anzac Street would have less traffic because traffic's not running end to end from Simon Street to Britomart. And then on the right is an example of how we could organize streets to to pull traffic out of streets, but also be really legible. And so it's directing traffic. So it's effectively cul-de-sacing that whole area. So if you're coming down Shortland Street, you're going to turn left before you hit Queen Street. And so trying to make that as legible as possible so people don't just end up at the bottom of the hillside and not knowing where to go. So it's all kind of self-enforcing as well. But then also we're trying to figure out management systems that would enable service and delivery vehicles. So these streets would have, all that purple area would be low traffic streets. So they wouldn't be pedestrian in the kind of 60s era. They would have lots of people doing service and delivery and other activities and disability access and things like that. So it's quite different than a kind of classic head mall. And I think that's the last slide. So hope that wasn't too long. I think I went, yeah, cool. Do you want to handle the questions, Ellie, if there are any?
Thank you very much, Kent. Favourite subject, wonderful. Wait, we've got one question. Do you want to unmute yourself, Josie? Or otherwise I can ask it. She says, hi, Ellie.
No, that's all right, Ellie. I'm here. It's a very long question, actually, a series of questions, and I'm sorry about that. Thanks very much. It's been really great listening to you, Kent. And we've sort of, I've followed, and I actually just drew my husband in, who's a transport planner / traffic engineer, into the conversation to discuss some of the things that you have been saying. I think the thing that I want to ask is, we consistently come back to how do we deal with the cost of doing this? How do we influence particularly residents and neighbourhoods to understand what the big picture is in relation to what you've been speaking about? And so that we can actually gain a lot more traction, because there's just such a long heritage in some of the places that you've been talking about. Is that what we need to build from first?
Yeah, no, so I guess a couple of things is partly the cost. So that example in Ghent was $10 million. And I'm not sure what Waltham Forest costs, but this is how you cheaply build a cycle network. This is how you inexpensively support people getting to their local shops without a car. So I think the cost thing is easy to explain. Obviously, cycleways on busy streets are really expensive, but kind of creating that base network, it's much cheaper to do it through the neighborhood. It's hard for people to imagine how things could be different. And that was what I was starting with, was people got a glimpse of what it could be like, but it's a constant battle. Like, how do you show people what things are going to be like? So this is, we helped with a project on High Street, where like everyone knows that High Street can be way better. But then even it had to happen before someone actually acknowledged how much improvement there was. There was a shopkeeper who's like, I had no idea it would be like this. So it's just really hard. And I don't have a clear answer besides like showing examples and getting more and more people. Like, it would be great to have people from a counselor from Waltham Forest who fought tooth and nail for that project, and having him explain the challenges to that project. It's communication, and it's inspiration, and it's imagination. It's like people can't imagine things to be better or different, and I think helping them along that. I think it's not a personal problem. It's just like people don't imagine how great Queen Street will be as a transit mall, or how great neighborhoods could be if kids could cycle to school again. So it's tricky. I'd appreciate if you have some ideas.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, is there a particular way in which you've approached it that you think has really worked in terms of actually being able to show and illustrate? And is there anything that that you could sort of provide to us that
Yeah, we
really captured the imagination?
yeah I think, and George is on here maybe, we presented A4E to probably 200 times, and George has probably talked to tens of thousands of people about it. I think the idea resonated with people because we have an infrastructure in place, the motorway ring road, that was never ultimately kind of used as a motorway ring road. And that's typical of Anglo traffic engineering, where we put in a ring road, but we're actually not letting traffic bypass neighborhoods. Traffic still pours through every street. And I think looking back too, like people have proposed a Queen Street transit mall or pedestrianizing Queen Street. So it's very kind of familiar territory. But I think the success of the Auckland City Centre has required a rethink about city streets and how people are using streets now. We have a massive residential population that's very supportive and very active. And they get it. And I think we did quite a bit of socializing, precedent work, concepts and schemes. But I don't know if any one thing was the most effective besides saying Queen Street Valley will be effectively car-free. And I think that's a nice selling point. And those traffic cells, like Wynyard Quarter, you won't have traffic coming off the motorway through Wynyard Quarter to get to the viaduct. I think people got that.
Could I also add that a lot of time was spent talking to the businesses as well? Like, for example, High Street, that was, getting buy-in from the right people first, I guess.
Yeah, well, High Street was a little, so Cam and ADO did a lot of work one-on-one with High Street that I wasn't involved with. But I guess one of the challenges for a long time on High Street was a kind of a broader vision of what's this street going to be like. And I guess the starting point was light rail on Queen Street and traffic pouring down Shortland Street and being forced to turn onto High Street. So our case study work helped resolve that. We didn't want traffic coming into the area that wasn't going to the area. And so we did a lot of work on service and delivery, what curbside space we needed to be freed up. Where do people park when they come in? How do we direct them to the car park specifically? How do couriers work? How do e-cargo bikes? How do we introduce kind of a low emission area? What kind of facilities would we need? So yeah, we thought a lot. We went through a lot in order to kind of create a working concept that the current High Street is now one of the pieces to that puzzle.
We've got two other really good questions, among others. Is there any key tactical urbanism approaches for building low traffic neighbourhoods?
Yes, it's that Levenshulme, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure. And at Waltham Forest too, this is the way they did those projects and the way they're increasingly doing them is they have an idea of how this will work, and then they put stuff in the street and they test it. And I think they make sure that it's a couple months in place, and then they go back and they ask everyone, is this the right tool for the job? So they're basically delivering those projects on a tactical urbanism method. Cool. That's not super cheap in some cases. So some of those planters are expensive, but it's also way cheaper than building a full diagonal diverter. Yeah, so they're doing that. So it's effectively moving traffic around. It's and that's the tactical urbanism approach, is being I guess acknowledging that it might not be perfect right away.
Another good question is, how do we retrofit low traffic neighbourhoods around Auckland's isthmus, particularly when town centres are often bang smacked in the middle of our arterials? Can we retrofit, or is our structure fundamentally flawed?
Yeah, so I think that isthmus arterials form the busy streets until we get to a point where we don't want traffic running from end to end from SH20 all the way to the city center, and in which case you might consider clipping traffic at Mount Eden or clipping traffic at Valley Shops on Dominion Road. But it's easy enough to, those would be massive calls, but I think that's inevitably we'll have to do that with something like light rail. But before we do that, the isthmus arterials form tidy kind of outer boundaries of a cell. And I think those are fine. We just need to figure out how we cut out the in-between streets that are between those big arterials. So between Dominion Road and Mount Eden Road, there's another street network that gets overloaded every time Dominion Road backs up. And the same thing happens at Sandringham. So Sandringham and Asquith, but there's just too many busy streets that aren't really designed to be busy streets. So those are the streets that you have to kind of push back onto your kind of defined traffic streets.
Someone said, I'd like to know more about how the discussion in greenfields areas and how to take developers on the journey for, I guess, areas that have yet to be built.
Yeah, no, it's, we've probably done schemes for 5 or 6 different areas. And I think it's compelling to developers because what we're doing is we're enabling neighborhoods to not have as many cars per household. And what that means is you have a bigger yield for the housing. You can start creating dense housing if you don't have 3 cars per household. So that's attractive to people. The other thing you do, or what you get, is you get streets that are your public space. So if you don't have traffic running from end to end, instead it's going to a consolidated car park or maybe a half buried car park. Those streets then become part of your offering to your future homeowners, or depending on what the tenure is. But so people really, they're really intrigued by the idea, and like that idea from Freiburg. I'm totally convinced it's the state of the art when you're starting with a greenfield. This is what you do, because otherwise you're wasting space on streets that are only used in the morning rush hour, and everyone else is too scared to use them for the rest of the day. And getting this car ownership down and getting density is well, then you get the virtuous circle of local services that can be supported by local populations. And then it just spins off from there. It gets better and better.
And we've got another question. I'm just trying to run you along because you're popular today, Kent. Someone has said, would stricter guidelines about transport planning help this? How do we get these hierarchical streets into New Zealand? Yeah, so I think, so the way everyone's probably encountered a project like this where you want to do something, but in some traffic department or transport department says, you can't do that because that's a secondary arterial, or that's a collector. Whatever it means, is like in their mind, it's really important. But what I guess what this does is it establishes the important traffic streets, so that things like collectors, you kind of don't want collectors because that means it's a traffic street, but it doesn't really carry that much traffic, and traffic's going too fast because there's so it kind of requires a rethink of street classification systems, and we try to do one with the Auckland Street Design Guide, and there's pieces of it there, but it's in particular the connector street, which we think is the tricky street that we kind of don't get right. It's not an arterial, but it's the streets that kind of end up having 6,000 cars a day. It has bus routes. Like, how do we design those better? But then ultimately, we want to have a hard line from those streets to a local street. We want ramps, and we want context change, and we want slow speeds. And I think that's just the easiest thing we can do. If 90% of Auckland streets are residential streets, they don't really have a traffic function, even though someone will put it in a model and pretend like it's part of the traffic network. The streets should be 30 kilometers an hour. And if we have to add ramps and other kind of interventions, then so be it. But I think it's just as a starting point,
people understand what neighborhood streets are, those should be 30 kilometers an hour.
And there's another question. So will inner city buildings dedicated to parking become repurposed for housing?
So currently, so for Access for Everyone, it was really important to understand where the parking buildings were. And we kind of designed traffic access to those car parks. So as a concept, we're like, come to the city center. We want you to come visit the city center, but all you have to do is drive to a car park. And that's what those car parks were designed for downtown and the Victoria Park car park. Repurposing them, I think, is it's like a secondary question. So like downtown car park after the commercial bay opens, and assuming we kind of return to city life and city center life, that would be an obvious kind of question mark of that's not the best use of space, and potentially you would, yeah, I mean, there's an ongoing debate of like, oh, do we add more car parking to the peripheral? That was also part of the conversation with A4E. And then, but then when you keep thinking about it, like the further and further you kind of pull it out of the city center, eventually you're just like, why don't you guys just take a bus like everyone else? It just kind of doesn't make sense. Like, yeah, and there's also tons of car parking. So I think the market will start making those choices, but there's nothing specific that Auckland Council is planning on doing.
And there's a question of how do you ensure accessibility for people in like wheelchairs?
Yeah, that was also one of the first things that we faced kind of pushback from, but I think that's also part of the imagination story, is that one of the things that limits people's mobility is traffic everywhere. And people on wheelchairs, it's going to be way better for people on wheelchairs because they can get an all-access pass, a total mobility program from Auckland Transport. They'll have access to the streets, and there'll be curbside space set aside for that activity to happen. And we have great examples of that happening on our shared streets, our curbless streets in Auckland, where it's perfect for a van to come in and drop a person in a wheelchair on those streets. So like, if any, it's going to be way better for people with disabilities and in wheelchairs.
Cool. I'm just trying to see if there's any further questions. Well, I'm going to call it quits anyway, because I feel like you have had a lot of questions so far anyway. And what we're going to do is, if I get tech right, I'm going to, I would have recorded this, and then we're going to add Kent's slides and his presentation, recorded presentation on LinkedIn, and you can fire away some extra questions to him. So Kent, thank you very much for coming along tonight. We had a great attendance. It looks like people are still actively keen on the webinars, which is fantastic, and it was a great subject. So everyone, have a great evening. Thank you very much for attending.
Cool. Thanks, Ellie. Bye, everyone.